Okay, so between 2015 and 16, I spent 15 months living and conducting ethnographic fieldwork in Kariakoo. And Kariakoo is an inner city district in Dar es Salaam, the most populous city in Tanzania and East Africa, and one of the fastest growing in the world. And in this lecture, I want to explore some questions of Muslim infrastructure that have emerged. And I aim to do three things in particular. First, I want to introduce two different modalities of Muslim infrastructure that I encountered in Tanzania. Two, I want to demonstrate how their contested workings offer an entry point into broader questions of Muslim politics in Tanzania. And third, in doing so, I want to demonstrate some of the analytic benefits of thinking infrastructurally about religion. And before I begin, I'd just like to briefly thank George Gasto, my friend, for his wonderful photographs, which appear on the poster for this event that Luna kindly designed, as well as throughout this presentation. So Kariakoo was first conceived in 1905 by the German colonial administration as a planned residential area for Dar es Salaam's growing African population. When the First World War broke out in 1914, this emerging African quarter acquired its name, a reference to the British Kariakoo, who were stationed at a large hangar in the neighborhood, visible here. At the end of the war, the League of Nations mandated German East Africa to Britain and became known as Tanganyika. Adopting a segregationist planning model, the British colonial administration implemented a cordon sanitaire, or neutral space, between Kariakoo and the quarters that were reserved for European and Asian residents. They also oversaw the conversion of the hangar into a central market hall for African residents. After the Second World War, Kariakoo became a lively and cosmopolitan neighborhood where urban newcomers from across the region, and indeed beyond the African continent, sought to settle. It was the cradle of Tanganyika's African nationalist movement and the beating heart of Dar es Salaam's burgeoning associational life. In 1961 and the subsequent birth of the United Republic of Tanzania, Kariakoo's commercial stature was consolidated. The old market building was replaced by Beda Amuli's multi-story market complex, and its monopoly on the wholesale of fresh produce was reinforced. Yet the local government never truly succeeded in its attempts to oust Kariakoo's informal business operators. From the mid-1980s, as the country entered a post-socialist or neoliberal phase, the number of street vendors and hawkers in the district would rise and rise. And with the dramatic expansion of container shipping in the Indian Ocean, residents would also have more access to manufactured goods imported from Asian countries. And from this point onwards, Kariakoo would see a surge of private investment, attracting real estate developers from across Tanzania, but increasingly from China, India, and Middle Eastern countries such as Yemen. This would precipitate an extraordinary reconfiguration of its social and built environment. Today's Kariakoo has developed into one of the most important commercial districts in East Africa. Its streets feature a contiguous array of shopping arcades, wholesale stores, and kiosks interspersed with mobile street vendors. Droves of people from across Dar es Salaam and neighboring countries converge in Kariakoo every day to trade goods. These goods are then circulated across not just the city, but also the wider East and Southern African regions. As Kariakoo has become more integrated with transnational circuits of capital, it's also become more dislocated from the wider city, coming to resemble an island sandwiched between two open spaces. The former cordon sanitaire, Mnazi Moja, on the one side, and the floodplain of the Jangwani Valley on the other. Kariakoo's vertical building density further sets it apart from Dar es Salaam's overwhelmingly low-rise urban fabric. Its market building is now overshadowed by a veritable forest of multi-story blocks. The city's congested streets feature a host of mobile and stationary activities, with pedestrians jostling. Kariakoo also has a certain social density, one that derives not only from interpersonal connections, but also from a set of unspoken rules that are shared by those that live and work in the district, often captured by the term ujanja or cunning. For the consumers who visit the district, this condition of ujanja makes it very difficult to get to the bottom of what's really going on. And all of this conjures an impression that, as people elsewhere in the city regularly told me, everyone in Kariakoo knows everyone. Exaggerated mythologies like they also spotlight Kariakoo's multiple semiotic lives within the urban imaginary. On the one hand, the city has become an emblem of infrastructural overload, deluged by a flood of entrepreneurial energy and frenzied construction projects. But on the other, Kariakoo's staggering transformation has become a subject of marvel and even pride. This old photograph circulated on social media depicts children playing in a dusty street in front of a row of single-story houses built with cement, plaster, and corrugated iron. And set against this almost romantic image of its humble origins, the district models a truly homegrown expression of urban modernity, initiated not by any kind of formal planning scheme, but rather through the accumulated aspirations and incremental efforts of ordinary residents. And because Kariakoo is experienced as an achievement that belongs to the urban majority, it's become a platform for articulating a claim to the city amidst conditions of marginality, not just as a site of episodic mobilization, but also of everyday practices of inhabitation and solidarity. Kariakoo had always been a warm, pulsing heart of the whole, writes the novelist Eli Shilema, enfolding so many people into the circle of her arms that she'd become overburdened. But still Kariakoo smiled, she writes. Before I discuss some questions of Muslim infrastructure that emerged during my time in Kariakoo, I want to give an overview of what I mean by infrastructure, and religious infrastructure in particular. And here my thinking is influenced by conversations with Yanti Hilchen and Genevieve Renza as part of our conceptualizing religious infrastructures project. In recent years, the term's increasingly found its way into academic publications. I know that researchers typically use it in a manner reminiscent of a term like transport infrastructure. So the modifier religious denotes a particular infrastructural subtype that's differentiated on the basis of its technical function. So accordingly, religious infrastructure is used to refer to arrangements and typically buildings and facilities that support explicitly religious activities, such as ritual practice, instruction, and charitable giving, just as transport infrastructure conventionally refers to those that support the movement of people, animals, and goods. And in this talk, I want to propose a different definition of religious infrastructure, which is inspired by two bodies of literature. So the first body of literature I want to speak to comes from the emerging field of infrastructure studies, and some of you will be familiar with this literature, but I just want to briefly highlight 5 key things that it seeks to do. The first is that it seeks to foreground the often backgrounded work that infrastructural systems do through acts of analytic inversion. The second is that it seeks to reconceptualize infrastructures as socio-material ecologies constituted not only by material artifacts and technologies, but also by people, ideas, regulations, knowledges, and capacities. The third is that it seeks to approach infrastructure as a verb rather than a noun, to quote McFarlane and Silva, as an emergent and relational process requiring maintenance, labor, and care. Fourth, it seeks to examine how infrastructures constitute social worlds and modulate sensory experiences by administering how different elements interact. Fifth and finally, it seeks to appreciate the politics of infrastructural arrangements, how they enact governmental imperatives, distribute things and resources unevenly, and how they can become grounds for concern and contestation. The second body of work that influences how I think about religious infrastructure comes from the study of religion. And this literature calls for more attention to be directed towards the material, technical, and sensory dimensions of religious experience and practice. So mirroring this recent thinking about infrastructure, researchers of religion have increasingly thought to apprehend religious formations as relational ecologies constituted not only by beliefs and meanings, but also material artifacts, technologies, and embodied practices. And these conceptual maneuvers make it difficult to draw tidy distinctions between religious subjects and their practices on the one hand, and then aggregates of physical and technical installations which support them on the other. In other words, they're shown to be mutually constitutive. And I want to ask, I guess, where does all this leave us with respect to the term religious infrastructure? And I'm going to begin with infrastructure. So I take infrastructure to denote a relational modality or role characterized by enablement. More specifically, a configuration that takes on an infrastructural role is one that functions as a condition for people and things to move and act together. Infrastructures are, in short, enabling arrangements. But let me narrow this definition a little further. The prefix infra distinguishes infrastructure from other kinds of structure by gesturing towards a quality of belowness. This doesn't necessarily mean that infrastructures are invisible, but rather that they're constitutively embedded or sunk into the higher order arrangements that they make possible. Infrastructures are arrangements that make practices possible without being explicitly foregrounded. To give an example, as I deliver this talk, I'm directly interacting with my computer and my mouse, my chair as devices. But this practice is made possible by a set of infrastructural arrangements which are cognitively and sensorially backgrounded. For example, the network of trained programmers and system administrators who are working to maintain our computer software from the other side of the world, or the well-lit room in which I'm seated. And importantly, this background status that I attribute to infrastructure is never permanent. For example, as many people have written over the years, infrastructures can be thrust into the foreground on breaking down. But the explicit technical function of configurations that are designated infrastructure is to act as a background enabling arrangement. Finally, religious infrastructure. So if infrastructure denotes a set of enabling arrangements, then religious infrastructures are enabling arrangements that are constituted by religiously marked things and relations. And I see that there are two key advantages to this definition. The first is that it leaves open the question of precisely what a given configuration acts as infrastructure for. This allows for the possibility that our religious configuration could function as an enabling condition or environment for practices that are not coded as religious. The second advantage is that it leaves open the question of who it is that a given religious configuration acts as infrastructure for. In particular, it creates space for an acknowledgement that, for example, Muslim infrastructure can shape and support the life worlds of people that do not identify as Muslim. Before returning to Kariakoo, let me just explain what I mean by modalities of religious infrastructure. So in my reading, there's no singular Muslim infrastructure. A Muslim infrastructure, my reading, is a set of enabling arrangements constituted by things and relations associated with Islam. So I could conceivably speak to any number of infrastructural configurations for which Islam acts as an anchoring reference point, to quote Gerda Heck, who I know spoke recently in a seminar. And I focus on two particular modalities of Muslim infrastructure because both loom large in the lives of Kariakoo's residents. I call them the Muslim infrastructure of Kariakoo and the national infrastructure for Muslim welfare. And this formulation is inspired by Jean-Paul Hadi's distinction between the infrastructure of and for suburbs. Just to unpack this briefly, what I mean by this is that the Muslim infrastructure of Kariakoo is a place-based arrangement that's developed by those that inhabit the district to meet specific localized needs. Meanwhile, the national infrastructure for Muslim welfare is not localized in Kariakoo itself, but it's rather a wider operational landscape that works to enhance the welfare of Muslims in the district and across the country. And the decision to analytically distinguish these two configurations shouldn't obscure their mutual entanglement. For example, some of Kariakoo's mosques are constitutive elements of both arrangements. But this distinction is really directly informed by my interlocutors in the district. Let me start by speaking a bit about the first of these. So while Kariakoo is a religiously mixed setting, it features a pronounced concentration of Muslim coded things and relations. So the number and scale of mosque complexes, the volume of the call to prayer, the prevalence of discernibly Muslim dress practices, greetings and foodways, the closing of streets for Islamic celebrations. These things and more contribute to a popular impression that Kariakoo is in some sense a Muslim neighborhood. A good deal of research about African cities takes for granted that such thickenings of public religious expression are fundamentally animated by a desire to control urban space. But what if they could entail something different? What if, to invoke Abu Malik Simone, they constitute an attempt to consolidate a relational platform which extends the capacity of residents to come together and act? Using an infrastructural lens, I want to show how the concentration of Muslim things and relations in Kariakoo comes together as infrastructure, configuring the district in ways that magnify the capacity of residents to secure livelihoods and to articulate claims. And to do so, I focus on two different infrastructural elements: garments and mosques. In Kariakoo, men are more likely than elsewhere in Dar es Salaam to wear Muslim-coded garments, including different styles of kafia, a kind of cap, and kanzu, a kind of loose-fitting tunic. Several of my interlocutors observed that where in the past young people would only wear these garments at Friday prayer or at festivals, they are increasingly worn on an everyday basis, with those who commute to Kariakoo from other suburbs making a conscious decision to do so. Indeed, a growing number of non-Muslim men also don these garments. These dress practices variously articulate claims to masculine respectability, commercial savvy, and urban belonging. However, here I'm specifically interested in how they bestow on men a heightened legibility within the urban landscape, ushering them into certain kinds of encounters. In the words of my interlocutor Ali, when I wear a kanzu, it attracts greetings from others. In turn, Muslim-specific greetings provide a reliable script for initiating and steering social interaction. Such displays of mutual recognition make, in my friend Hassan's words, the brotherhood between Muslims stronger, further consolidating existing relations between acquaintances. They also provide a platform for heightened social access between total strangers, enabling men in Kariakoo to forge new ties with fellow traders. Several of my interlocutors went on to describe the protective affordances that these garments extend to their wearers. Fundi Chamba observed that to wear a kanzu is like a protection. ulinzi, no matter which kind of kanzu. The reason for this is that the kanzu shields men from the attentions of police who routinely stage crackdowns on unlicensed business operators in the district. To quote Shebuge, if a police patrol meets a man without a kanzu, they can be called and interrogated. Yet if they do wear one, police will say, oh, this man isn't Ustaz, so we won't take him in. In other words, men who wear a kanzu are engaged in a certain performance of moral piety, one that would make police think twice about targeting them, since this would be widely perceived as plainly unwarranted, even discriminatory. I was intrigued to find that my interlocutors made similar observations about the 14 mosques in Kariakoo, several of which number among the largest and most esteemed in Tanzania. Kariakoo's mosques inscribe themselves into the district in multiple ways, from the sonic polyphony that their amplified adhana then generate before the prescribed times of prayer, to the silence that the Muslim men overflow into the streets, tessellating around lorries and across shop thresholds. However, mosques also exert a more ambient influence on the urban landscape, namely by creating a certain field into which police are unwilling to intrude. This is partly because Kariakoo's mosques have often acted as assembly points for protests against civil rights infringements and social inequality. These factors augment the general air of respectability that mosques embody, as Omari and Hassan elaborated. The district policeman, Omari said, can't come here to the mosque to inspect the place, so those who are here are protected by the mosque. The police respect these people in these places, so they can't make a scene. Similarly, Hassan said the police can't come to the mosque because they respect the place, and the government doesn't need problems with religion. Both the government and society believes that the mosque is a good and safe place where nothing bad can be done. I'm quite interested here, incidentally, in how this oscillation between notions of respectability and also the threat of problems arising. So for precisely this reason, Kariakoo's mosques are sites where unlicensed vendors congregate, as well as more itinerant workers. In Fundi Chamba's words, many who are day workers have to stay on the steps of the mosque so that if their phone rings, they can go from there. The new regional commissioner says that those who are found loitering on the street in Kariakoo will be arrested. So the mosque is like a safe place for them to stay. If you are outside a house, for example, the police can go for you. Whereas if you're at the mosque, you can say you're attending to mosque matters. So here, Chamba shows how the concentrated distribution of mosques in Kariakoo augments the protective affordances of the dress practices that I've described. Even beyond the vicinity of the mosques themselves, if a man wearing Muslim dress was apprehended by police and accused of loitering, mosque matters provide a perfectly credible pretext for their presence in the district. So when I speak about Kariakoo's Muslim infrastructure then, my intention is not to conceptualize mosques as infrastructure, nor Muslim-coded dress practices. Rather, these elements together help constitute a broader set of Muslim arrangements in Kariakoo that come together as infrastructure by enhancing residents' capacity to expand, consolidate, and protect the channels through which they secure livelihoods. Keeping in mind the opacity of Kariakoo's social worlds, these insights demonstrate how the district's Muslim infrastructure further shields it from external interference. And in doing so, it facilitates Kariakoo's transformation into a shared platform for survival and resistance amid conditions of precarity, one that can draw near and engage larger scales of economic operation on its own reticulated terms, beyond standardized arrangements and universalizing logics. As Anat Singh observes, it's precisely such livelihood patches that, despite seeming isolated and marginal, help constitute the global political economy. And indeed, it's through their work that many majority populations experience globalization. So on the one hand then, an infrastructural lens brings into view how Kariakoo's Muslim arrangements, no less than its electrical grid and waste management system, hold together socio-material conditions of life support and survival. On the other, it spotlights how Muslim arrangements constitute enabling conditions for global entanglements that are typically represented with sole reference to non-religious domains and arterial flows. So briefly, as I go into show, this first modality of Muslim infrastructure that I discuss is perhaps not immediately recognizable as infrastructure. And that's partly because of its opaque and implicit operations, but it's also because it diverges from normative ideals of what infrastructure entails, ideals that owe a great deal to hegemonic, northern-centric perceptions. And thinking with and from a number of southern cities, researchers have increasingly sought to challenge these norms by bringing recognition to more informal or experimental systems of infrastructural provision that are devised, even constituted by residents themselves. And as Lohan et al. Suggest, that in the case of southern cities like Dar es Salaam, it'd be a mistake to present these modalities of infrastructure as alternative arrangements, when they in fact often constitute the majority condition. So using this table as a heuristic device, we can see that the first modality of infrastructure that I describe is unplanned, assembled incrementally, governed informally at the level of the district by ordinary residents in response to localized needs. The second infrastructural modality that I now describe is rather different in all of these respects. I'll come back to this table in a second. So in the 1930s, a government clerk called Kleist Sykes, pictured here with his three sons, was one of several influential residents who established a Muslim welfare organization in Kariakoo, the Tanganyika Muslim Association. And this association inaugurated the idea of a national Muslim public organized around a shared concern for Muslim welfare, and particularly the issue of Muslim education. This was because Muslim residents had less access to formal education than their Christian counterparts, many of whom had attended European missionary schools. In the lead up to independence, this issue caused a controversy within the African nationalist movement, when some Muslim leaders took issue with the overrepresentation of Christian political candidates on account of their educational credentials. Following independence in 1961, the issue of Muslim education reappeared once again, this time in relation to the activities of the East African Muslim Welfare Society. This society sought to improve Muslim living standards by building dispensaries, mosques, water reservoirs, wells, and schools across the country, even planning the construction of an Islamic university. In doing so, it articulated a vision of an infrastructural commons which would improve the social and economic welfare of Muslims. President Nyerere openly acknowledged the importance of addressing the country's education disparities, and to this end, he had nationalized the mission schools. However, the East African Muslim Welfare Society was banned in 1968, and it's widely believed that the government figures perceived their cause of pan-Islamic unity to be a threat to the ruling party's nationalist project, and accused the society of mixing religion and politics. The government moved quickly to establish a replacement body, the Supreme Council of Tanzanian Muslims, or BAKWATA. And today, BAKWATA remains the state-backed institution for overseeing Muslim affairs in mainland Tanzania. And in effect, BAKWATA inherited responsibility for the national infrastructure project envisioned by the Tanganyika Muslim Association and the East African Muslim Welfare Society. Accordingly, BAKWATA is charged with developing and governing an apparatus of physical facilities, services, and bureaucratic procedures across Tanzania, including mosques, education institutions, charitable endowments, and community development programs. Returning to the table, we can see that the second modality of Muslim infrastructure is, in contrast to the first, planned and engineered rather than improvised. Moreover, it's governed at a national level by a centralized organization via bureaucratic means rather than at a street level, manifesting instead as an operational landscape. And in this respect, it's more aligned with modernist ideals of infrastructural provision and service delivery. So in what follows, I'm not so interested in the material workings of this infrastructure, but rather how it's constructed discursively and imaginatively in Kariakoo. This is important because, as a number of recent studies have shown, the efficacy of infrastructure is not restricted to its explicit technical function. Infrastructures often articulate and ground a certain promise of developmental progress and modernity. They can also become evocative emblems of developmental failure, eliciting feelings of nostalgia, anger, and abjection. While my Muslim interlocutors in Kariakoo often had radically different opinions on political matters, they were unanimous in their criticism of BAKWATA. BAKWATA isn't helping Muslims develop, I was routinely told. There are two recurring points of controversy in this regard. The first relates to the failure of BAKWATA to rectify the still entrenched disparities between Muslims and Christians with respect to educational attainment and infrastructure. One man told me, there are over 20 Christian universities, but only one Muslim university. Under Nyerere, we had the opportunity to benefit from Egyptian funding, but this was cancelled by the government. I blame BAKWATA. If BAKWATA were good leaders, they could have got Gaddafi to build a good university here. BAKWATA has failed to make use of this for the welfare of Islamic society. These educational inequalities are widely understood to have inhibited the social mobility and influence of Muslims by restricting their access to white-collar jobs and positions within government institutions. The second point of controversy concerns the sale of charitably endowed assets by BAKWATA or wakf properties. And when walking around Kariakoo with Fundi Chomba, he'd point out endowed plots in the district that had been sold to developers over the years, like as if they were scars in the urban tissue. These concrete metaphors, to quote Akhil Gupta, of infrastructural dispossession evoked a deep sense of resentment in Chomba that would register visibly on his face as a grimace. Indeed, in 2012, a wakf property located elsewhere in Dar es Salaam was earmarked for sale by BAKWATA, and it led to a heated demonstration leading to 50 arrests. The protesters transformed this plot into a site of contestation, from which the vision of a national infrastructure was defended and demands for state care were articulated. In addition to allegations of incompetence and political quiescence, BAKWATA officials have also been repeatedly linked with financial irregularities. So, I've not got the quote here, but Hassan elaborated, BAKWATA has been given a lot of things for the benefit of Islam, land, buildings, and other items, but they're using them for their own self-benefit. BAKWATA uses its assets not to resolve the problems that Muslims face, but more like a supermarket. BAKWATA sheikhs are driving around in luxury cars. More controversially, some Muslims claim that the National Infrastructure Project has been deliberately hamstrung and systematically dismantled by BAKWATA on behalf of the Tanzanian government in order to reproduce conditions of Muslim marginalization and Christian hegemony, Mfumo Cristo. The increased reliance that the Tanzanian government has placed on Christian institutions to deliver education and health services since the 1990s has led further credibility to this conspiracy theory. So this widespread sense of dissatisfaction among Muslims regarding BAKWATA's governance of the national Muslim infrastructure has led to a proliferation of alternative Muslim NGOs dedicated to Muslim welfare. It's also provided grounds for assembling an emergent Muslim counterpublic, which has instigated several episodes of mobilization in recent decades in protest against violations of Muslim rights. And these expressions of activisms have not, as is often suggested, been animated by transnational currents of Salafi extremism or whatever, but rather they're a widely held set of grievances considering uneven infrastructural development along religious lines in Dar es Salaam and Tanzania. And these grievances have been inscribed into the infrastructural landscape of the city through acts of protest and the circulation of popular histories. Public intellectuals in Dar es Salaam like Mohammed Said speak of the forgotten ancestors of Kariakoo. Muslim residents like Abdul Wahid Sykes, who helped win independence and whose names he claims have been deliberately erased from official histories. Indeed, these were the very same Muslim residents who set about engineering a national infrastructure for Muslim welfare that would close the development gap between them and their Christian counterparts. For my activist interlocutors in Kariakoo, there was a sense that they were living amidst the ruins of these frustrated aspirations for infrastructural modernity and for social mobility. In turn, the concentration of Muslim things and relations in Kariakoo, this paradigmatic site of infrastructural neglect, has come to index for them a nationwide condition of Muslim disenfranchisement. It elicits feelings of resentment and indignation. So, by way of conclusion, and I might need a couple more of extra minutes, so forgive me, but this is me coming in to land with this. I want to briefly consider these two modalities of Muslim infrastructure alongside one another, but not in an abstract way this time with a table, but in relation to how their contested workings play out as part of the lives of Kariakoo residents. And more specifically, I'm interested in how a particular moment of infrastructural contestation in the district offers a window into the politics of Muslim identity in Tanzania. So I mentioned earlier the 2012 protest at the wakf plot, which led to 50 arrests. So in that same month, 5 churches had been attacked following an incident in which a young Christian boy had desecrated a Quran. One outspoken critic of BAKWATA, Sheikh Ponda Issa Ponda, was charged with inciting these riots, along with scores of protesters. In subsequent months, Muslim protesters assembled in the district after Friday prayer to stage 2 large-scale demonstrations against these arrests, with both leading to clashes with the police. Ponda was eventually released, but between 2013 and 16 was repeatedly detained for his alleged use of inflammatory language. He was shot at and hospitalized during a protest and eventually imprisoned for violating a suspended sentence. And while the sale of the wakf plot was prevented, this short-lived Muslim movement failed to win broad-based support. And religious issues had far less bearing on the 2015 and 2020 general elections than in 2005 and 2010. The triggering event for this brief movement was the arrest of Muslim protesters, but this incident keyed into the aforementioned grievances held by many Muslims in relation to the state. And it's noteworthy why these protests were staged in Kariakoo. Fundi Chompa explained, Kariakoo is the source of everything. If you want lots of demonstrators, you need to organize in Kariakoo. Also, if you start the protest march from Kariakoo, you can hide from the cops in the streets. Here, Chompa's not simply talking about the quantifiable concentration of people in the district or its spatial composition. He's also alluding to the shield-like capacities that Kariakoo possesses, which make it possible for people to evade police. Indeed, in this sense, the sense that Kariakoo is the source of everything derives from the perception I mentioned earlier that Kariakoo is a platform that somehow belongs to the urban majority. Going further, note that it was once again mosque matters that provided the pretext for protesters to assemble in the district, namely Friday prayer. Put differently, the protesters can be seen to have temporarily hacked the Muslim infrastructure of Kariakoo as a vehicle of mobilization and disruption for staging their claims. In the years that followed, my conversations with residents in the district revealed how these events were framed with reference to different scripts or moral commentaries. Those critical of the protests, among them many Muslim residents, often reproduced government rhetoric, attacking the credibility of the protesters and their leaders by branding them hooligans, troublemakers that are seeking to disrupt Tanzania's climate of social harmony and peace. Sheikh Ponda in particular was accused of having hidden financial interests. Activists' claims regarding BAKWATA were dismissed by several of my Muslim interlocutors as symptoms of a pervasive blame culture among many Muslims, dismissing them as idle complainers who'd be better off if they just worked harder. Correspondingly, those sympathetic to the protests felt dejected that the movement had been snuffed out. They proposed that government figures had infiltrated the mosques in the district and found ways to silence the most outspoken sheikhs, propagating a corrupted and quiescent BAKWATA Islam. They also directed that ire at young men in the district, accusing them of being capricious and cowardly like flags in the wind, and using their Muslim affiliation as just a means of advancing their personal interests. So to conclude, I want to draw out how these discursive practices speak to the salience of infrastructural arrangements, ideals, and concerns as sites of experimentation and contestation from which different configurations of Muslim identity in Tanzania are formulated. By staging practices and discourses of protest in relation to different configurations and questions of Muslim infrastructure, dissenting residents articulate a sense of being Muslim that is defined in opposition to BAKWATA Muslims and the dismantling of the national infrastructural commons that they're perceived to facilitate. They challenge those that place the onus on Muslims themselves to work harder and smarter to achieve social mobility, instead demanding that the state recognize their right to a functional and autonomously governed national infrastructure that actually improves Muslim welfare. To quote Fundi Chomba, who tellingly evoked an exemplary infrastructural metaphor, "You can say you people, Muslims, are lazy, but when there are no tunnels in place that can provide water, what are you going to drink?" Meanwhile, in their criticism of Muslim flags, my activist interlocutors observed that the Muslim infrastructure of Kariakoo has been calibrated to enhance the livelihood practices of residents, working to merely alleviate rather than challenge systematic conditions of Muslim marginalization. And all of this points really to an infrastructural question that runs through the heart of this politics, namely, what kind of enabling conditions should be built with the relational affordances that Islam engenders? Or more pointedly, what should Muslim infrastructure do? Thank you.